Victor Black slid the resignation letter across his mahogany desk, his cold smile never reaching his eyes. "Just sign it, Alex. Make this easy on yourself." My hands trembled as I stared at the paper that would end my 5-year career at Sterling Financial. 3 months after delivering the highest quarterly revenue in our division's history, I was being pushed out the door like yesterday's trash. "This is about the Excelsior account, isn't it?" I whispered, though we both knew the truth. Victor's jaw tightened. The Excelsior deal had been my masterpiece, a $12 million client that I'd courted for 8 months. But somehow Victor's name was on all the credit reports. "Sign the letter, Alex. HR is waiting." His voice was ice cold, final. I looked around his corner office, at the awards on his wall that should have been mine, at the promotion certificate he'd received for my work. My throat burned, but I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I picked up the pen, knowing I had no choice. But as I signed my name, one thought burned in my mind. Someday, he would need me more than I needed this job. The record quarter had started with a miracle. I'd been tracking Excelsior Industries for months, studying their supply chain, understanding their pain points. When their previous financial advisor dropped the ball during a critical merger, I was ready. I worked 18-hour days, canceled weekend plans, and poured everything into landing them. The day Excelsior signed, Victor wasn't even in the office. He was golfing with his buddies from the country club. But when the commission reports hit his desk the next morning, suddenly he was everywhere. "Great team effort," he announced in the Monday meeting, taking the spotlight as if he'd been there all along. I watched from the back row as Victor described his strategy for winning Excelsior. Every detail was mine: the research, the pitch, the relationship building. But he spun it like he was the mastermind, and I was just the assistant who helped with paperwork. That's when I realized Victor hadn't just stolen my credit. He'd stolen my future. The Excelsior deal was supposed to be my ticket to the senior advisor position. Instead, Victor used it to secure his own promotion to regional VP. My VP forced me to resign after a record quarter. Then he had to beg for my help during a surprise audit. That's my story. And 3 months ago, I never thought I'd be telling it. I'm Alex Carter, and for 5 years, I believed hard work and honest results would speak for themselves at Sterling Financial. I was wrong. Victor Black taught me that some people will steal your victories and call it leadership. He taught me that being good at your job means nothing if someone above you is willing to lie, cheat, and manipulate to get ahead. But Victor also taught me something else. Something he didn't mean to. He taught me that eventually, every house of cards falls down. And when it does, the people who built their success on lies suddenly need the people they stepped on. This story isn't just about revenge, though that part felt pretty sweet when it happened. It's about what happens when someone who's built their career on shortcuts finally runs out of other people to blame. It's about the moment when integrity becomes the only currency that matters. Victor's pattern was simple but effective. He surrounded himself with people who either couldn't threaten him or were too scared to try. His inner circle included Jamie, a nervous analyst who nodded at everything Victor said, and Paul, a smooth-talking salesman who was great at schmoozing but terrible with details. They called themselves the Victory Squad, Victor's little joke about his own name. They'd take long lunches, play golf on company time, and always seemed to know about opportunities before they were officially announced. Victor made sure his favorites got the easy clients, the warm leads, the deals that were practically guaranteed to close. Meanwhile, people like me got the difficult accounts, the long-shot prospects, the clients who had been burned by financial advisors before. Victor would smile and say it was character building, but I knew better. He was setting us up to fail while his favorites coasted to success. The sick part was how he'd frame it in meetings. "Alex really thrives with challenging clients," he'd say, making it sound like a compliment. But we all knew what he meant. I got the scraps while his buddies got the feast. The Excelsior theft wasn't Victor's first rodeo. I started paying attention after that, and the pattern became clear. 3 years earlier, my colleague Michelle had landed a major insurance contract. Within a month, she was transferred to a different department, and Victor was presenting his success story to upper management. Last year, It was Carlos. He developed a new client retention strategy that increased our division's repeat business by 40%. The week after Carlos submitted his report, Victor called him into his office for a career development conversation. Carlos was suddenly interested in exploring opportunities in other divisions. I remember thinking these moves were strange, but I trusted the system. I thought merit would win out eventually. I was naive enough to believe that good work would protect me, that someone would notice if credit was being stolen. The Excelsior deal was different, though. It was too big to quietly transfer away, too visible to completely erase my involvement. So Victor tried a new strategy. He rewrote history. In his version, I was the junior member of his team who helped with data collection and client coordination. The first warning sign came 2 weeks after Excelsior signed. I was reviewing our quarterly compliance reports when I noticed something odd. Several client files were missing key documentation. Forms that I distinctly remembered filing, audit trails that should have been automatic, backup records that had simply vanished. At first, I thought it was a computer glitch. Our system was old and sometimes 8 files, but when I checked with IT, they told me the deletions had been manual. Someone with administrative access had deliberately removed the documents. I started keeping my own copies of everything. Call it paranoia, but I printed out emails, saved client communications to a personal drive, and photographed important documents with my phone. I told myself I was just being cautious, but deep down, I was starting to understand the game Victor was playing. The missing files weren't random. They were all related to my biggest successes, my most innovative strategies, my strongest client relationships. Someone was systematically erasing my fingerprints from the work that defined my career. When I mentioned the missing files to Victor, he shrugged it off. "Probably just a system cleanup," he said casually. "Nothing to worry about." Victor's cover-up attempts became more obvious after I started watching for them. During team meetings, he'd interrupt whenever I tried to discuss my direct client relationships. "Let's keep focused on big-picture strategy," he'd say, steering the conversation away from specifics that might highlight my contributions. He also started scheduling important client calls when I was out of the office. Somehow, my calendar would show conflicts that I'd never created, or I'd get last-minute assignments that took me away from key meetings. When I'd ask to be updated, Victor would wave it off. "Just routine check-ins. Nothing you need to worry about." The most infuriating part was how he'd reframe my questions as insubordination. When I asked about client strategies, he'd say I was micromanaging. When I requested access to files, he'd accuse me of not trusting the team. Every legitimate concern became evidence that I was difficult to work with. I realized Victor wasn't just stealing credit. He was building a narrative. In his story, I was the problematic employee who questioned leadership, couldn't work as part of a team, and took too much personal credit for group achievements. The pressure campaign started subtly. Victor began scheduling our weekly one-on-ones for Friday at 5 p.m., when most people were heading home. He'd keep me waiting in his office while he took urgent calls that somehow always involved weekend golf plans. During these meetings, he'd nitpick everything. My email tone was too casual with clients. My presentation slides had too much detail. My follow-up reports were either too comprehensive or missing key insights, depending on his mood that day. He also started excluding me from informal gatherings. The Victory Squad would disappear for lunch without mentioning where they were going. Client dinners that I'd normally attend suddenly became leadership-only events. I'd find out about important developments through office gossip instead of official channels. The isolation was calculated and cruel. Victor was slowly cutting me off from the relationships and information that made me effective at my job. I couldn't serve my clients properly if I didn't know what was happening in the company. I couldn't contribute to strategy discussions if I wasn't invited to the meetings. Most people in the office could see what was happening, but they kept their heads down. Nobody wanted to become Victor's next target. The false accusations started in April. Victor called me into his office with a thick folder of performance concerns. Inside were emails I'd never seen before, client complaints that had supposedly been submitted directly to him, meeting notes that contradicted my own records, and time-tracking reports that made it look like I was constantly missing deadlines. "Alex, we need to talk about your recent performance," he said, his voice full of fake concern. "I've been getting feedback that suggests you're struggling with some of your responsibilities." I stared at the documents, my heart pounding. Half of them contained information that was completely false. The other half seemed to be taken out of context, twisted to paint me in the worst possible light. One client complaint was actually a compliment that had been edited to remove all the positive language. "These documents don't match my records," I said carefully. "Can I see the original submissions?" Victor's smile was cold. "Are you suggesting that I would fabricate performance issues? That's a serious accusation, Alex." The way he said it made it clear that questioning him would only make things worse. I left that meeting knowing I was trapped. Victor had complete control over the narrative, and anything I said in my defense would be twisted into more evidence of my attitude problem. The resignation ultimatum came the day after our biggest quarterly review. I'd prepared a detailed presentation showing my client results, revenue contributions, and strategic initiatives. For 20 minutes, I laid out exactly what I'd accomplished, backed up with numbers that couldn't be argued with. Victor listened with a stone face. When I finished, he slowly closed his laptop and folded his hands on the desk. "Alex, I think it's time we discussed your future here at Sterling Financial." He opened a different folder, not the performance complaints from before, but something worse. Inside were resignation letters, severance packages, and transfer request forms, all pre-filled with my information. "You have 3 options," he said calmly. "You can resign gracefully with a positive reference letter. You can request a transfer to our Detroit office, where frankly, your skills might be a better fit. Or you can force me to begin formal disciplinary proceedings based on the performance issues we've discussed." The Detroit office was Sterling's equivalent of Siberia, a tiny branch that handled small business accounts and had zero growth potential. The disciplinary proceedings would destroy my reputation in the industry. The resignation was the only option that left me with any dignity. "I'll need to think about it," I said, though we both knew I didn't have a choice. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at 3 flash drives on my kitchen table. For months, I'd been quietly documenting everything, not out of paranoia, but out of professional habit. I kept detailed records of client communications, project timelines, strategy sessions, and revenue reports. What I hadn't realized until that moment was how much evidence I'd accumulated. Every stolen idea, every misattributed success, every false accusation Victor had made was contradicted by the documents I'd saved. I had email chains that proved my direct involvement in major deals, client testimonials that praised my personal contributions, and financial records that traced revenue directly to my efforts. The Excelsior file alone contained over 200 documents, initial research reports, pitch presentations, client meetings, contract negotiations, and follow-up strategies. All of it showed my central role in landing the account, despite Victor's claims that he'd led the effort. I realized I wasn't just holding evidence of Victor's lies. I was holding proof of systematic fraud. He'd been taking credit for other people's work for years, manipulating performance records, and possibly violating company policies about client relationship management. But I also knew that fighting him directly would be useless. Victor had allies in HR and management. I needed a different strategy. I submitted my resignation letter the next morning, but I didn't go quietly. Before my last day, I made sure to say goodbye to every client I'd worked with personally. I framed these conversations as routine relationship transitions, but I also wanted them to know who had really been managing their accounts. "It's been a pleasure working with you directly," I'd say. "I hope the transition to Victor's direct management goes smoothly." Most clients seemed surprised to learn that Victor would be taking over personally, since many of them had never spoken to him before. I also reached out to colleagues at other firms, people I'd met at industry conferences, former Sterling employees who'd moved on, and contacts from my university alumni network. I didn't badmouth Victor or Sterling, but I made sure people knew I was available and looking for new opportunities. My last day was remarkably quiet. Victor made a brief announcement about my decision to pursue other opportunities, and that was it. No farewell lunch, no goodbye speeches, no acknowledgement of 5 years of dedicated service. But as I packed my personal items, I noticed something interesting. 3 other employees approached me privately to exchange contact information and express support. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who'd been watching Victor's behavior with growing concern. Within 2 weeks of leaving Sterling, I'd lined up freelance consulting work with 2 boutique financial firms. My industry connections proved stronger than I'd expected. People remembered my work, even if Victor had tried to erase my credit for it. The freelance life suited me. I could choose my clients, set my own standards, and build direct relationships without worrying about office politics. More importantly, I could be completely honest about my track record and experience. Several clients specifically sought me out because they'd heard about my work at Sterling through industry channels. I also started building a network of former Sterling employees. Apparently, Victor's behavior had driven away a lot of good people over the years. We didn't organize against him or anything dramatic like that, but we stayed in touch. We shared job opportunities, gave each other references, and occasionally compared notes about our experiences. Through these conversations, I learned that Victor's pattern went back even further than I'd realized. People who'd left Sterling years earlier told similar stories about stolen credit, false performance reviews, and pressure campaigns. It seemed like I was just the latest in a long line of casualties. But I also learned something else. Victor's methods were catching up with him. Without competent people to steal from, his results were starting to slip. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 3 months after I'd left Sterling. I was reviewing client portfolios when my former colleague Paul called, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Alex, I hope you're doing well," he started, trying to sound casual. "I was wondering if you might be available for a quick conversation about some technical questions related to your previous work here." Technical questions. That was interesting, since Paul had been part of Victor's inner circle and had never shown interest in the technical details of anything before. "What kind of technical questions?" I asked carefully. There was a long pause. "Well, we're dealing with some compliance inquiries, and we're having trouble locating certain documentation related to client accounts you managed, particularly the Excelsior Industries file." My heart started racing, but I kept my voice steady. "What kind of compliance inquiries?" Another pause, longer this time. "The State Financial Regulatory Board announced a surprise audit yesterday. They're reviewing all major client acquisitions from the past year, and they've specifically requested detailed documentation for Excelsior Industries." I almost smiled. The audit I'd been hoping for had finally arrived. According to Paul, the audit notification had arrived Monday morning without warning. The State Financial Regulatory Board had received anonymous complaints about irregular sales practices and documentation irregularities at Sterling Financial. They were conducting a comprehensive review of all major client acquisitions, sales processes, and compliance procedures. The audit team had 48 hours to set up on-site at Sterling's offices. They wanted complete files for every client account over $5 million, detailed records of all sales activities, and documentation proving that proper compliance procedures had been followed. Victor's initial response had been confident. "We have nothing to hide," he'd told the staff. "Full cooperation with the audit team, business as usual." But when Victor sat down to compile the Excelsior file, he discovered a problem. Most of the detailed documentation was missing. The initial client research, the relationship-building records, the strategy development notes, the negotiation transcripts, all of it was gone from the official Sterling systems. What remained were high-level summary reports and final contracts, but nothing that showed the actual work process. Without the supporting documentation, it looked like Excelsior had simply appeared out of nowhere and signed a $12 million deal for no apparent reason. The audit team had already flagged this as suspicious and requested additional information. Paul explained that Victor had spent 2 days searching for the missing Excelsior records. He'd contacted IT about data recovery, checked backup systems, and even had the cleaning crew search through archived paper files. Nothing. The weird thing is, Paul said, it's not just Excelsior. We're missing detailed records for most of Alex's major accounts. It's like someone systematically removed all the background documentation. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Victor had spent months deleting my fingerprints from these deals, and now he needed those exact fingerprints to prove the deals were legitimate. That does sound strange, I said innocently. Have you checked with the clients directly? Sometimes they keep copies of communications and meeting notes. Victor tried that yesterday, Paul replied. But here's the thing. Most of these clients thought they were working primarily with you, not him. When he called Excelsior to request copies of their records, they asked to speak with you instead. They said you were their main point of contact and would know what they needed. The irony was perfect. Victor had stolen credit for my relationships, but he couldn't steal the relationships themselves. The clients still remembered who had actually done the work. Paul's call was just the beginning. Over the next 3 days, I received messages from 6 different Sterling employees, all asking variations of the same question. Did I happen to have any records related to my former clients? The desperation in their voices was obvious. Victor had apparently turned the office upside down, looking for documentation that could satisfy the auditors. He demanded that everyone search their personal files, email archives, and even desk drawers for anything related to my accounts. The audit team had expanded their investigation beyond Excelsior Industries. They were now requesting detailed files for 4 other major clients I'd brought in, representing over $30 million in total revenue. For each account, they wanted to see the complete sales process from initial contact to final contract signing. Victor's problem was simple but fatal. He'd erased the evidence of my work so thoroughly that he couldn't prove the sales were legitimate. To the auditors, it looked like Sterling Financial had somehow convinced major corporations to hand over millions of dollars without any documented sales process. The missing documentation raised obvious questions about possible kickbacks, undisclosed incentives, or other forms of financial misconduct. The audit team was now treating Sterling as a potential fraud investigation. Victor's first direct contact came through a carefully worded email sent to my personal account. The subject line read, "Professional Inquiry, Sterling Financial," and the tone was stiffly formal. "Dear Alex, I hope this message finds you well in your new endeavors. Sterling Financial is currently assisting with a routine regulatory review, and we would appreciate your cooperation in providing any records or documentation related to your previous client relationships." He went on to explain that the request was purely procedural and that my assistance would be greatly appreciated. The email ended with an offer to compensate me for my time as a consulting fee. I read the message 3 times, savoring every carefully chosen word. Victor was trying to make it sound like a normal business request, but the desperation leaked through. He was offering to pay me for information that should have been in Sterling's official files. I let the email sit in my inbox for 2 days before responding. When I finally replied, I kept my message brief and professional. "Thank you for reaching out. I'd be happy to discuss this matter. Perhaps we could schedule a phone call to review the specifics of what you need." I didn't mention that I had exactly what he was looking for. I wanted to hear him ask for it directly. The phone call came the next morning. Victor's voice was strained, lacking the smooth confidence I remembered from our Sterling days. He started with small talk, asking about my consulting work, commenting on the weather, but I could hear the tension underneath. "Alex, I'll be direct," he finally said. "We're in a bit of a situation here. The regulatory audit has identified some gaps in our documentation, particularly for the accounts you managed. We're hoping you might have kept personal copies of client communications or project files." The word "hoping" was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "That's interesting, Victor. I thought all client documentation was maintained in Sterling's central systems. Are you saying those records are missing?" "Not missing exactly," he said quickly. "More like incomplete. The auditors want to see detailed process documentation, and our current files don't include some of the background materials they're requesting." Another pause. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was physically painful for him to produce, Alex, I know we didn't part on the best terms, but I'm asking for your help here. The audit results could impact the entire division. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Victor, I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly, I said. You need documentation that proves Excelsior Industries and my other clients were acquired through legitimate sales processes, and you can't find those records in Sterling's systems. That's right, he admitted, and you're asking me to provide personal records to help demonstrate that these sales were conducted properly. Yes. I let that sink in for a moment. Victor, these were accounts that you took full credit for. In your presentations to management, you described yourself as the lead relationship manager for Excelsior Industries. Are you now saying you don't have records of your own client management activities? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Victor finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Alex, please. I need your help. I'm willing to consider it, I said finally, but I'll need full transparency about what's really happening with this audit, and I'll need Sterling to officially acknowledge my role in these client relationships. What kind of acknowledgement? He asked warily. A formal letter stating that I was the primary relationship manager for Excelsior Industries and the other accounts in question. Signed by you and filed with HR. Victor agreed to my conditions faster than I'd expected. Within 4 hours, I received an official Sterling Financial letterhead document acknowledging my central role in client acquisition and relationship management for Excelsior Industries and 4 other major accounts. The letter was a complete reversal of everything Victor had claimed during my final months at Sterling. Instead of describing me as a junior team member who assisted with data collection, the document stated that I had led all aspects of client development, from initial research through contract negotiation and ongoing relationship management. It also noted that my innovative strategies and deep client insights were instrumental in securing these high-value accounts, and that my departure had created significant challenges in maintaining these crucial business relationships. Reading the letter felt surreal. After months of having my contributions minimized and my competence questioned, Victor was now officially crediting me with exactly the achievements he'd previously claimed for himself. But the letter was also evidence of how desperate Sterling's situation had become. Victor wouldn't have agreed to put these statements in writing unless the audit posed a genuine threat to the company's future. I called him back that afternoon. I received the letter, I said. Now let's talk about what you actually need. What Victor needed was simple. Everything. He needed my client research files, communication logs, strategy documents, meeting notes, negotiation records, and relationship timelines. He needed proof that Sterling Financial had conducted thorough due diligence, followed proper sales procedures, and maintained ethical client relationships. More specifically, he needed evidence that I had done all of these things while representing Sterling Financial, not evidence that he had done them himself. I agreed to provide the documentation, but I set my own terms for the handover. Instead of simply emailing files to Victor, I arranged to present the information directly to Sterling's compliance team and the regulatory auditors. I want to make sure the auditors get complete and accurate information, I explained. Since I was the primary relationship manager for these accounts, it makes sense for me to walk them through the documentation personally. Victor tried to object. He clearly wanted to review everything first and control how the information was presented. But he didn't have a choice. The auditors had already expressed frustration with Sterling's incomplete records, and they welcomed the opportunity to speak directly with the person who'd managed the client relationships. The presentation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I had 5 days to organize 5 years' worth of documentation into a comprehensive audit response. The Sterling Financial conference room felt different when I walked in Tuesday morning. The same mahogany table, the same leather chairs, but now I was the one in control. Victor sat at the far end of the table, looking pale and defeated. The audit team occupied the center seats, their laptops open and ready. I spent 3 hours walking them through my documentation. Every client interaction, every strategic decision, every compliance checkpoint, was backed up with detailed records. I showed them my initial research on Excelsior Industries, including competitor analysis and market positioning studies. I presented communication logs that traced relationship development over 8 months of careful cultivation. The auditors asked pointed questions about sales processes, compliance procedures, and client verification methods. I answered each one with specific examples and supporting documentation. It became clear that not only had I followed proper procedures, but I'd exceeded standard requirements in most areas. When I finished the presentation, the lead auditor thanked me for my thoroughness and professionalism. Then he turned to Victor. "Mr. Black, can you explain why these detailed records weren't available in Sterling's official files?" Victor's answer was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak about system migrations and archival procedures, but everyone in the room knew what had really happened. The audit results were released 2 weeks later. Sterling Financial received a formal reprimand for inadequate documentation procedures and irregularities in sales process oversight. The company was required to implement new compliance systems and undergo quarterly reviews for the next 2 years. Victor Black was quietly removed from his VP position and transferred to a special projects role with no client responsibilities. The official announcement cited organizational restructuring, but everyone knew what had really happened. 3 months later, I received a call from Sterling's new division head. They wanted to discuss bringing me back as a senior advisor with a significant increase in compensation and a guarantee that I would receive proper credit for my client relationships. I politely declined. By that point, my consulting practice was thriving, and I had no interest in returning to corporate politics. But I did accept their offer to provide ongoing consulting services for Excelsior Industries and my other former clients. The best part was seeing those clients' reactions when I told them I was available to work with them again. Excelsior's CFO actually laughed out loud. "Thank God," she said. "We were getting tired of pretending Victor knew what he was talking about." 6 months later, I was sitting in my home office reviewing client portfolios when my phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. Victor Black had updated his profile. His new title was Independent Financial Consultant, the same description I'd been using since leaving Sterling. I couldn't help but smile. After years of building his career on other people's work, Victor was finally on his own. No team to steal from, no subordinates to blame, no corporate structure to hide behind. Just his own skills and reputation, which turned out to be less impressive than he'd pretended. The whole experience taught me something important about integrity versus shortcuts. Victor had spent years taking the easy path, stealing credit, manipulating records, pushing out competent people who threatened his position. It worked for a while, but eventually, the truth caught up with him. I'd chosen the harder path, keeping detailed records, maintaining client relationships, building my reputation on actual results rather than office politics. It led to some difficult moments, including being forced out of a job I'd loved. But in the end, my approach proved more sustainable. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's just being ready when the truth finally matters more than the lies.